Who can prophesy the weather? A prophet. We tend to think of foresight. The biblical book of prophets, Nevi'im, is from the Hebrew word for prophet, which is navi, which has less to do with foresight than it does with argument or criticism. Now, the biblical book of Nevi'im, it's part of the Torah, and it's nestled between Torah and Ketuvim. The whole body is Tanakh. Right. I think it's best to start with stories. My name is Mark, and if you're watching this, perhaps you might be a student, a friend. Perhaps you're trying to figure out whether or not to take a class with me. That is the hope. If not, perhaps you've just found this on the great wide web, and in which case, welcome, and I hope you're having fun, or will. There's many notes which have not necessarily been memorized, so if this is a little disjointed, please bear with me and enjoy the trip. But yes, return to belief, to faith. The idea here is I'd like to talk a bit about diversity in religious identity, religious literacy, for lack of a better all-encompassing term. Now, when we say religion, I mean it's become sort of the R word, a curse or something to be frightened of. There is the idea, and it's no quip on anyone, but this concept of I'm spiritual, not religious, as if someone's body and history or the choices they've made in relation to what they adhere to might be something to be ashamed of. Not that being spiritual is bad either. I think it's just that these terms have become quite loaded, thanks in no part to the institutions and the abuse that have accompanied any organization in human history. In any case, I'd like to talk about diversity, and to go about that, I'd like to talk about myself first. So, despite the ginger beard, I am the product of a few mixing histories. My mother's side, my grandmother was Greek Orthodox. She married a Catholic, and of course they compromised and joined the United Church, where my mother taught Sunday school, so a Protestant tradition. So right there we've got three branches of Christianity all represented. My father's side, on the other hand, were both Holocaust survivors. So my bubby, who is still around, thank God, was a German Jew who worked in a work camp. And it's funny, when we define Jewish identity so often, it's defined by what sufferings have we undergone to get through to the place we are now. My father's father was a survivor of Auschwitz, and I don't know the story, unfortunately. Nonetheless, a history of meeting religions, meeting faiths. Now, I ended up going to an all-boys Catholic high school, which you may have noticed on my toque earlier, Loyola. And I went there, I suppose, by the graces of bursaries, but I also went there and was interested in that place because on a first visit at 12 years old, I was fascinated by what seemed like a knightly ideal or a commitment to some form of higher order. Both because there were a bunch of men wearing a white lapel who were priests, and I didn't understand that, and I knew something about the Jesuit order and their commitment to education and learning, and that they'd been all over the world, but also because I was just curious about people who believed something I didn't. I might be giving my younger self a bit more credit than's due, but I think I've always been interested by diversity of belief. Right. In any case, going through that system, usually when I tell the story, most people have a set of assumptions about what we learned, and usually in many regards they're right. But the thing is, for 4 years we learned about what the Catholic Church believes, and because we were among so many people and so many priests from different backgrounds, knowing that there was diversity in something so absolute. When we got to our world religions class at the end of those 5 years, by nature we just understood that if you're encountering another system or lack thereof, that it's filled with contradictions, but also it's filled with many personal stories and many individuals who might not agree on every single element. For Catholics, I mean, there's the Nicene Creed, there's the idea of the Holy Trinity of God, the Spirit, and Christ. But beyond that, I mean, as much as the Church has doctrine, there is so much depth to those waters. So when we got to our last year in grade 11 here in Quebec, we understood that when someone identifies as a Buddhist or a Hindu, that there's much more to that story. There's much more to that story. I'd actually like to transition now to talk a bit more about religious literacy. And I'll take the example of 2,000 years ago, when we begin our calendar, but when we also tend to consider the period of Christ. And the period of Jesus of Nazareth is also the period of Second Temple Judaism, which I think is one of the most fruitful periods of should be one of the most fruitful periods for study in religion, but also in history's multiplicity. Now, we tend to consider that period as quite monolithic. For most Jewish folk, we would consider Judaism as a traveling body that's not unified by geography, but unified by belief. The thing is, like all systems, this wasn't always the case. If we go back to 2,000 years-ish ago, we'll use the example of what we know of Jesus, historical Jesus, and Jesus as he is written about in the Gospels and in Paul's letters, which happened after Jesus was around. That's important. When we tell this story, we still transform it, as I'm doing right now. So, Jesus, as he walks around, gathering his gang of boys, and occasional girls, but mostly boys, Jesus and the boys walk around the Middle East, the area surrounding what would be modern-day Jerusalem and its banlieue, its suburbs. As he does, he gets into certain arguments with certain groups. We know Jesus would have been a Jew. And we know that he argues with people called Pharisees. And he argues with them specifically about food and about the people who sit at their table. And yet, when we talk about Christ, he's defined as a countercultural figure for the time because of the people he let sit at his table and what he ate and who he allowed to eat with him. So maybe one of the first golden rules of religious studies that I wanted to share is that those we are closest with are often those we will find most conflict with. We fight in families more often than strangers. There's always a footnote. If you see me pause, it's just what's going on. In any case, so we know that there's a group of Jesus people, but we also know there's a very large group of Pharisees, and that the audience for the texts receiving the Gospels or passing through the Gospel would go, right, those odd people, those Pharisees. And yet, for somebody on the outside, the reason he's defining himself as not a Pharisee is because anybody who would meet him would say, right, food, sitting with different people, weird, Jesus is a Pharisee. So, division is often invented to prevent coalescing identity. Okay, that's the first part. We know that the Pharisees were not the mainstream group of Jews at the time. We know that in the Second Temple, there were there was a caste system. We had the Kohanim, the Kohens. It's maybe a familiar name for Montrealers of Leonard Cohen. But we also know that there were a whole assembly of other groups. Mine is Levi, so the temple protectors, the guards, the warriors, per se. I'm throwing that in. It sounds like a flex. I didn't mean to. But there's a whole caste system that works towards the maintenance of the Jewish temple in Jerusalem and all the celebrations that might happen there. When Jesus walks into Jerusalem, many people talk about his idea with the ideal of overthrowing the moneylenders' temples. In the context of Thanksgiving, good gracious. It was in the context of Passover that this happened. I think of meals with birds and meats, but in any case. It was Passover, and the population of Jerusalem during Passover celebrations, the Jewish holiday, would balloon from thousands of people to 1 million people in the span of... If you've seen images of the old city of Jerusalem, it's full now, but if you could picture that this area 2,000 years ago filled with 1 million people, for the holidays. The idea of the moneylenders was not a worship of cash. The idea of moneylenders was that for anybody who was visiting from abroad who might have different currency or not have currency, that they'd still be able to do devotion when visiting Jerusalem, to be able to buy a ram or a goat or something to slaughter. Killing an animal was considered a really good thing. There's another story for that, but maybe another time. When Jesus overthrows the moneylenders' temples, it's not a protest against cash, but rather a rejection of the larger community. It's a rejection of that exchange, and indeed a signal that a new order is either coming or should be coming, but that the one in place is not just. Although it is really cool, the romanticism of overthrowing the moneylenders' tables, but it's not exactly the case. So we have the Pharisees. We've got all of those who believe that the temple is the center of Jewish life, the Second Temple, the Temple Mount. But we have another group, which is so important. As with the history of any organization, there are always, with no ill will meant, but the zealots. And this was also true for the time in Judaism. We had a group called the Essenes, who were sort of a monastic desert community. Think of the, without spoilers, the latter part of the Dune movie, the latter part of the Dune book. These people who are outside of mainstream society. No spoilers. The Essenes were really, really interested in the preservation of texts, and were very weird, and were considered really the outsider group par excellence for this time period. I'm putting a break there. Let's fast forward 1,940-ish years, vaguely. Some boys are playing around a cave area in Qumran, so Middle East. I'm looking at a computer that is trying to tell me something. Silence. The caves of Qumran. These boys end up stumbling on a collection of very, very old jars, some of which have been looted, sadly. But they notice many of these old jars, and they end up telling adults, as a child does, and it's discovered that these jars have preserved the oldest copies of many of the biblical books, Genesis and Samuel especially, in existence. And the craziest part is that the texts we have that have been translated this entire time are very, very, very almost parallel to the texts that are in these jars. Very important thing. The oldest copy of the book of Genesis, which, again, a step back, has been the basis for, I'm about to say something really controversial, the basis for every ill act in human history, that we, man, has dominion over the world. The oldest copy of the book of Genesis that legitimizes our place in the moral order. That's not always a bad thing, but that book, the oldest copy, was found in a room, in a jar, beside the Book of Jubilees, which is a fan fiction retelling of the Book of Genesis, but they were found side by side. And so for whoever had gathered these books, the Book of Genesis and the Book of Jubilees, which tell different versions of a similar story, were considered to be on the same level. Not all of humanity believes in the book of Genesis, but those who have taken most power in the history of humanity believe in the book of Genesis. And we know that 2,000 years ago, those individuals had a more open mind to consider that there was an alternate history to our foundations. Jump back 2,000 years. The people who preserve those, we understand, are the Essenes. And thus, the preservation of our most central texts was done by a group that didn't have any measure of political power, who were, for lack of a better word, ascetic outcasts, with a dire commitment to the preservation of the word, who were considered zealots, who were considered antisocial, but who still had the capacity to understand that there were multiple versions of the truth. If you take that as a bit of an extrapolation, that's okay. There are multiple truths. Okay. Why did I tell this story? On a first level, because I myself am the product of many beliefs. That's basically the heart of what I was trying to say. And so much as this discussion has been about a religious tradition, the hope within it is also to address interpretation on the larger scale, and to try and show that when looking at texts, when looking at stories, there is a larger body of possibility than usually what's laid out. Hello, again. I'm back with a costume change. So, why was I telling all these stories? What's the point of this talk? On the one hand, it's to look at the diversity inherent within anything we see as a pillar. And that goes both for, we've been talking about religious histories, but we ourselves are the products of so much multiplicity. We are each salads of a certain sort. But it also applies to the texts we study in whatever form, whatever stories or narratives, that there is always so much more behind it than we might perceive. This applies especially for an English language arts classroom because despite the volume of history that might be related to a given text, say Lord of the Flies or what have you, the body of an individual's experience meeting another story is always unique. And while it'll find parallels and find power in parallels with the experiences of others, that digestion, that filter is always unique in the universe to that individual's body of experience. So on the one hand, it's to emphasize the importance of individual history, that everyone is important. The other important part, though, is recognizing that history and the students that I or others might be engaged with. You know when you're trying to look decent, I'm trying to get my sweater to look cool. Excuse me. See, that's my history coming into effect. But the importance here is also in recognizing the diversity of the students within facing oneself, both because our students will be more and more of backgrounds that are not, we always say Judeo-Christian, but it's not really Judeo. These are individuals who will come less and less from Christian backgrounds, at least here in Quebec. There's the diversity of your classroom: Muslim, Hindu, atheistic, agnostic, questioning, unsure, those who reject all of the labels I just tried to put on them. There will be so much facing a teacher, and I think it's so important to recognize the histories that might have informed those individuals, whether or not they're contesting them, but to recognize that those histories will inform how they process the texts and stories that I'm telling. The other important part is to widen the idea of story, to not solely what we consider the religious texts. I opened up with talking about the R word and spiritual, but also for the narratives that have formed us from outside of these. I first encountered Star Wars when I was 3 years old, when I was given the gift of a C-3PO playset, and I remember the vibrant gold, and the only other thing I'd ever seen that was so shiny was a Christmas tree. That was a religious moment. And, I mean, the symbolism, but the playset, it's a Micro Machine playset, opens up to reveal a small world of the Star Wars Cantina inside, one of the most important cinematic moments of cinematic history. And then I saw the movie. And that idea of right and wrong, which is all Joseph Campbell, but that conception of dark side and light side formed me. Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, the Silmarillion, these are all also texts that inform our spiritual well-being, and we need to open up the horizons of what can inform the religious sense and not be afraid of that word either. I guess to close off, my favorite play is Inherit the Wind by Jerome Lawrence and Robert E. Lee, which I had the privilege of acting in a few moons ago. It's the story of the Scopes monkey trial. So school teacher who is basically indicted by his local community for teaching evolution in the American South in the 1920s, and a case that captivated the budding United States and its early sense of national unity. Anyways, he teaches evolution. He's a teacher. He's responsible for the upkeep of that community's future generations in a changing world of the 1920s. And that community is very religious, very, very evangelical, let's say. And there's a beautiful scene in the movie, repeats a little hauntingly, of everyone singing this old American folk song, Give Me That Old Time Religion. And I always loved the song and was very conflicted because it's not necessarily supposed to be the best thing. But I have always liked that song, and now I can look back with happiness because I love that song even more, because now I know that that old-time religion was filled with so much conflict and debate, arguments, désaccords, but also so much attempts to understand diversity. And indeed, there's so much multiplicity in that old-time belief. And so my history, my experiences of everything all of the time is not new and weird. It's a part of humanity's turns. And so give me that old-time religion. It's good enough for me.